Offensive and derogatory to be called coloured in South Africa. Khoisan leaders say yes, and it's time to change it. Former Cosatu Western Cape leader Tony Ehrenreich has asked President Cyril Ramaphosa to get involved. I asked him what he is hoping to achieve. Tony, tell me about your letter and what your intentions are.
Well, we wrote a letter to the President to ask him to intervene in a matter that's of real importance to the coloured community in South Africa.
What is the issue? And is it all around coloured mentality, which is really gaining momentum at the moment, isn't it? The dialogue around it.
There are issues that are being dealt with in respect of the coloured mentality and coloured culture and a range of coloured issues. This is slightly different. This is asking the presidency to intervene in what I believe is the de-Africanization of coloured communities. We have a variety of African cultures. Those are Xhosa, Zulu, Venda, all of the others. But coloureds are excluded from that because of the ANC statement that says blacks in general and Africans in particular, coloureds are excluded from what the definition should be. And we believe that that's wrong. For historical reasons and for cultural reasons, coloureds should be part of Africans in particular because coloureds are part of the African community and part of the African culture.
Is that why coloureds feel that they've been ignored by the ANC because of an identity, or is there something else happening? Do you think coloureds are not highly regarded within the ANC?
Coloureds have always played an important role in the liberation movement from the early days of the ANC to the UDF and subsequent to that. Trevor Manuel was the most senior finance minister, so there's been an incredible role for members of the coloured community. But this issue is about how does the ANC and the state categorize coloured people.
That's what I'm asking.
And that's what it's got to come down to. We've got to make sure that all the cultures are recognized equally. The coloureds at the moment are not recognized equally to the Sothos and the Xhosas and the Zulus, and that's wrong and that must be fixed. And that's a historical inaccuracy that we want the presidency to address.
But changing the name, though, to Camisa, which I believe is what you favour, will that make a difference?
Well, part of our concern about the notion of coloureds, it was an apartheid construct. The Group Areas Act and the Population Registration Act define people as coloureds to put them in different silos. We can't continue with those silos of apartheid in New South Africa. So we've got to move away from that categorization. We've got to bring our people closer together. Some people favour the name Camisa, some people want to be San or the Khoi or a range of other names. We think Camisa is important because before Jan van Riebeeck got in 1652, there was a vibrant trading post that was made up of a multicultural group of people from all over Africa. And they started to represent that melting pot of what came to constitute coloured communities, people from all over, including from Africa. And that's why we think that banks of the river where the castle is today built, that sweet water that came there in many respects represents both the history and the legacy of coloured people in Cape Town and in South Africa.
What about the coloureds? And when I asked a little bit earlier on about coloured mentality, because obviously this sits into your story, those coloureds who want to be known as coloureds and not black Africans, who fear that this might just be changing a name for the sake of changing a name.
Well, I think there are some people who are comfortable with the name coloured, and people are entitled to define themselves culturally as they choose. I think the majority of people are starting to say we've got to work out how do we deal with this issue, because if we want to be part of the cultural identities that makes up the South African nation, then we've got to be clear about how we see ourselves. Now, none of the cultural groupings are a homogeneous group, but it's about finding a sense of a minimum program and a minimum value system that represents that culture that's going to be important for all of us. So a discussion has to be held. But the point that I'm making is different from the broader discussion about culture and value and identity for coloured people. It's about the standing and the equality of coloureds in relation to Xhosa and Sotho and Venda, and it's that equality issue that must be dealt with. Coloureds are Khoi and San and Dutch immigrants and people from Malaysia and slaves from elsewhere. So all of them, when they have one of their forebears that's rooted in South Africa, should be defined as African by the ANC's definition and by the coloured. So we're running it wrong in the way that the definition of African is played out in South Africa. And that's what I'm asking the President to address, but to address it in the historical facts and in the historical context, not an emotional thing. Factually, coloureds are as African as Xhosa and Sotho, and that's what the government must step in and help us to resolve sooner than later.
So what do you think needs to be done? Obviously, discussions need to be had. What's the next process then to make this change happen? And if Camisa is the name that is voted in favour of, How do you get that to happen?
Well, it seems that it's going to be a fairly easy process because we've got to agree that we want the historical facts to define how the whole situation resolves itself. So not about your point of view or mine, it's what does the historical facts say? And we think history is on our side in respect of the cultural rights of coloureds to be part of Africans, so that we can fix pretty easily. Then coloured people must come together because many coloured leaders are emerging because they think there's an opportunity and opportunism. We mustn't allow that. We must come together, we must define our culture, we must codify our value system, and we must make sure that we start to create an environment that represents future and legacy to young coloured men and women. It's a real problem that young coloureds are going into gangs and abusing drugs and many of the other social problems. We've got to start addressing that as part of the cultural issues that we're confronting.
That's one of the conversations, isn't it, that many coloureds want to walk away from the name, the term coloured, because of the negative association of coloureds, which many people, rightly or wrongly, associate with drugs, gangs, as you say.
I want to walk away from coloured because coloured was defined by the apartheid system from the 1910s to 1955 when the Population Registration Act was put in place. So that's just wrong. We can't be defining...
But is there negative association?
There's absolutely anything that was used to draw racial disparities between people, as the apartheid state had with coloureds and whites and Africans. That is wrong. And that's the kind of Nazi history that we have that we've got to move away from. We've got to find a word that represents what our ambitions are and what the role is that we played in Africa. The river that flows into the castle at the moment is a representative of life, of prospects, and of all of the rich history that coloureds have played in Cape Town. So I think that that's a word that has some popularity, but it's not imposing a word on anybody. We must find the common denomination that we're all comfortable with, but it's about having a real conversation and pulling in the people that has the political power, like the President's office, to help us to resolve this, because we can't resolve...
Do you think he'll get it? Would he be open to it?
We hope that the presidency will take these things serious, because the biggest challenges in South Africa is poverty, unemployment and inequality. But you can't solve them unless you also deal with the cultural aspects, so that people redefine themselves in a new sense. The history of South Africa and apartheid had torn our people's menswaardigheid apart. We've got to find a way to restore that, giving people a sense of identity, undoing the negativeness of the name and term coloured, I think goes a long way to doing that, and it's an important part of the conversation that must be taken forward.
And ultimately for everybody to be South Africans.
Absolutely. We are South Africans, we are black Africans, and we think it's important that we find a way as black and white and all the hues in between to get closer to each other. There's a fragmentation of our society. We can undo that by making sure our people understand how they come to the conversation, but the conversation's about a South Africa where all of our people feel that their interests are vested and represented.
And there's a growing momentum. More and more people are talking about this, about pushing for change, making something happen. Why do you think it's happening now?
I think as things become more difficult and we see our communities fragmenting, people are looking to find different ways to respond to those challenges. And part of the issue is identity and culture and a value system. So people are trying to reach back into that and hoping that young people can find resonance with that. So everybody's trying for different reasons to come to it. There, of course, are also opportunists who want to try and see themselves occupy traditional positions like the Zulu chief or somebody else and get a whole lot of money out of it. That's not what we're looking for here. What we've got to define is our equality as a coloured culture, equal to Sotho and Zulu in the statutes of our country and in the recognition of all of our political parties, because that sets an important foundation for us to come together and instill the value system that all the cultures must advance amongst their constituencies.
Ehrenreich speaking to me a little earlier on. He's the former Cosatu Western Cape leader.